All right. Once I see confirmation from the YouTube, I will get us going. All right. I see confirmation on YouTube, so I guess we are good to go. We are live in the modern world, and we are today talking about mental health and popular culture. So thank you everyone for coming today for this today's popular culture dialogue. This is a topic that I think there's a lot of different approaches we could take to it, whether it is the representation of mental health in popular culture or the ways in which popular culture may impact mental health, whether for good or for bad, or the messy and the complicated. I thought maybe today we would start more on the representation side, but if we talk more about the other side too, it's totally fine. I'm going to go where the flow takes us. As per usual, though, for these conversations, I like to throw it to our panelists to talk about themselves and introduce who they are and what brings them here today. And because I see a newcomer to these dialogues, Kath, we're going to go to you first.
Thank you. So my name is Kat, and I'm a recovering PhD student that abandoned her PhD after 8 years. I have a master's in critical disability studies. I'm a multiply disabled, non-binary white person, and my research for my master's and for my PhD was on fan fiction communities and spaces, and specifically disability in fan fiction. But I started being really interested with representation. Initially, I was going to do something on how disability was represented. And just because I'd been in fan fiction community, I got really interested in how fans saw and consumed and produced pop culture. So that became something that was more of interest, but I'm still very much into pop culture. I think pop culture is one of my main interests in life as a person and as a ongoing, I think once you've been in academia for 14 years, you're kind of your brain gets rewired in a specific way. So that's how you look at popular culture. And that's pretty much my background. So I was invited by Dean because we were collaborators in a special issue in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies on disability and fan fiction. And so I'm very excited to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me in this discussion.
Wonderful. Glad to have your perspective. And I like the idea of a recovering academic in some ways. To me, you're going to be an independent scholar because I think everyone can be an academic. You don't need an institution. But thank you for being here, Kat. Then we'll go over to what is on my left. We'll go to Mars.
Hi, I'm Mars Pebronzar, he, him, and I'm a current PhD student. I'm researching transgender representation, viewership, and authorship of horror media, in particular film and television, at Sheffield Hallam University. And I think I'm here because the intersections in my research and also in my past research on in my master's, I've done research on fan fiction and specifically trans narratives of male pregnancy and gender non-conforming pregnancy in fan fiction. And both in that and here, mental health does keep coming up because when you're studying an oppressed group, there's going to be influences, and there's obviously a convergence of statistics of prevalence of mental health in oppressed groups, and how that informs their representation, if that makes sense, as well as my own personal experience as a transgender person of mental health struggles and exactly what I just said, but also apply to my life.
Wonderful. Yes, I mean, and I think you're from Italy and you're studying in the UK, correct?
Yeah.
And I don't know how it is in the UK right now, but in the United States, we just had an entire state essentially make it illegal to wear gender non-conforming clothes
Yeah.
and appearance. And I'm just like, how do you enforce that? But the mental health ramifications of that is going to be so immense.
Yeah, I mean, it's also not a new law in America. And like, yeah, in the UK, especially, it's quite close by to Sheffield, where I am. There was like a few weeks ago, the murder of a trans girl, a 16-year-old. And obviously that's going to affect, like existing in this world as a trans person, while this is happening in itself affects your mental health.
Yeah, exactly. So good. I'm glad you're here today to present those perspectives for us. And then we'll go down to Princess.
I'm Princess Nicolí. I'm from St. Lucia in the Caribbean. I have degrees in history, religion, and literature, and my research is focused on gender violence and pop culture and mental health, and how those intersect with history and religion.
Yeah.
And as somebody who also has mental health issues, how it is depicted in pop culture is very important. Yeah.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you, but I was going to say it's not like there's any intersections between history, violence, mental health, and religion in human history at all. So
why would there be?
Yeah, well, never heard about that before. So it's wonderful you're here to provide those perspectives for us as well. And I think we've had talks in the past too about how to look at popular culture, and there is more of an interest in looking at past popular culture now too. And I think it'd be fascinating to know how we might be seeing these same issues in past popular culture. So I don't know if we'll talk about that, but just, putting a bug in your ear to maybe think about. What I do want to start with is, from each of you and your perspectives, what do you see as the current status for mental health depictions in popular culture? Do you think that we're on the right track? Do you see some hope out there? Do you still see a lot that needs to be addressed? I mean, what do you see as like the current state of how the representation is going? And it might be more specific to where you are, but I'm just curious what you're seeing in terms of representation.
Well, for me, I really focus on mental health in soap operas and in sci-fi and fantasy. So for those genres, I feel there's a lot of work to be done in the depiction of mental health.
How so?
Yeah. I don't like how the depiction of mental health is that you're either a violent criminal in a lot of the soap operas, or you're just this victim that can defend yourself, or they blame it on something else. Yes.
If I can add, because it connects on like this idea of like the violent criminal, like of course I'm looking at horror specifically. So the horror genre definitely has a long history of demonizing mental illness, and especially when it comes to like I'm looking at trans representation, often it exploits mental health difficulties to justify its transphobia. I'm thinking like classics like Silence of the Lambs present these characters like Buffalo Bill who are insane. Obviously that's a terrible word, like, but that's how it's presented within the narrative, and that's why they want to dress like women, and therefore they want to skin women alive, as if those things in any way correspond. And I think there has been an improvement in the representation in more recent years, especially with like a wave of films that use the horror to talk about trauma in interesting ways, where like I'm thinking not super recent, but a film I really liked that's horror as a metaphor for mental health was The Babadook, which is a very wonderful analysis of grief through this monster. So I definitely think there's steps there's an improvement that is happening, but there is still a long way to go, especially when you look at films like Split that are still coming out, where I don't even know where to begin with that one, frankly. And there's definitely some illnesses that are way more stigmatized than others, like DAD for sure.
And
Yes.
just to quickly point out, if you thought the Babadook was interesting, Guillermo del Toro did an anthology series for Netflix, and the director of Babadook had one there that also does some similar things. That is a good comparison as well. And Kath, go ahead, please.
I think for me, like one of the things that's of interest is like the role that like changing technologies are playing on like who has access to being able to shape narratives. So we're seeing like with the a lot of platforms like Netflix and Prime and all these kinds of things, in the same way that like they are like they exist within like a capitalist like economic structure. They have permitted kind of to a certain extent the death of television and of like single like creator narratives. And I find that interesting because you're seeing all of a sudden you have access to money that's being given to creators that perhaps like would not have access to creating narratives. And so one of the things that I found that's interesting specifically about disability and about mental health is that there are like counter discourses that are being created. So there's less of an hegemony of like of what like mental illness like or mental health issues mean. So you still have like this like tendency to equate like mental health issues specifically with deviance and with like a marker of deviance. So often, like I feel that that's one of the reasons why it's really linked to marginalized identity, where you have like, well, this is a marker on top of it of how like both of these identity are deviant and don't belong like in society. It becomes like a cipher where all of the anxiety of that people have about society become like represented by these characters and these narratives. But I do think that there's a multiplicity of like point of views and different types of narrative, just because like they're given the chance to expand on this. And from the point of view of myself as somebody who's looking at like fan communities, I think that fans specifically like in fan fiction, but fan art and in like discourse, play a huge role in how like audiences are interpreting it, which is separate but related to how the narrative is meant. So people are being like fans are extremely they're extremely critical about and they'll bring in like these layered analysis that I think like make it so that it's no longer simply as like the narrative is being pushed into popular culture and it means whatever it is that that the creators intended, but it's also like you have like this possibility of seeing how audiences are taking that up. And they're bringing their own narratives, which makes it like a much more complicated like discussion. But that's not happening in the mainstream. It's happening like within these marginalized community. But I think it's useful for people with for people that are disabled, that have mental health issues, to have like these platforms. So I do think that it's complicated by technology in that way.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is, on the one hand, we do still see maybe some problematic representations, especially those that occur in specific genres that utilize tropes and shortcuts and heuristics and these stereotypes to other people and to create quick recognition of characters. So horror, crime procedurals, soap operas, and so on and so forth. We do perhaps have some movement in those genres. My perspective, I do see like comedy doing perhaps more in this regard. And I like, Kath, your point then too about the expansion of what we consider television content and all the different ways we can get content now and how it's just called content. because you look at Netflix and their BoJack Horseman, and they've had Tuca and Birdie, and they've had various shows where the characters' struggles and coping with mental health is kind of like at the forefront, and it's talked about. It's not just like used to stereotype or demonize or things like that. And then of course we have fans who kind of historically have been engaging in these counter discourses and alternate discourses and things like that. But the question I have then for all of you, is it an issue if these discussions that are potentially more helpful than harmful, is it a problem that these discussions may be occurring only in smaller, maybe niche, alternate communities rather than the mainstream?
I think it is. Because like when you're looking at counter discourse, I think like what you're looking at is there's these like spaces within like the mainstream. There exist these holes, if you want, and these spaces where people can do counter discourse. But the overall like mainstream discourse about mental illness is still largely like negative, and it's still largely like doesn't empower the voices of people with mental health issues, disabled people, and so forth, right? And I think that that's still the mainstream discourse that, like, if you're looking at like the people in general, I think that that's still like that idea, these stereotypes that people have that they're going to go through. And popular culture is often how a lot of people that don't have disabled people in their lives access narratives about. This is how they form their ideas, and there have been like studies that show this. That's often like the case. And when it comes to mental issue, I think it's even more complicated because the stigma is so high, and so like in employment. I currently work for the Canadian government. I'm Canadian, and what I do is DEI, and the stigma around like workplace, around being able to get accommodation for mental health is like huge. And it is totally, in my opinion, linked to how it is that we have these stereotypes that then get like they get institutionalized in like employment, in like who can access like housing and education and so forth. And it's in that respect that I think that they are very powerful.
Yeah, in looking at fandom specifically, I think that's an interesting dynamic because fandom specifically, like I grew up on Tumblr essentially. That is my first approach to fandom has been Tumblr or fanfiction platforms, and they've always been places that obviously there's going to be a very specific demographic that is attracted to those spaces to begin with. They already filters a lot of that mainstream conversation. So like there's a lot of queer people, for example, and there's spaces where a lot of the pop social justice conversation is happening, right? A lot of I came out of like middle school knowing concepts like amatonormativity, which a lot of people outside of that pop fandom bubble don't know. A lot of these conversations are happening in this very confined environment, and then like, which of course we are interpreting the media in our own way and projecting and having those conversations that they really do not translate in real life in the more mainstream conversation. I think that the key word being mainstream, because obviously there's going to be a lot of wonderful media, a wonderful art that discusses mental health in a more nuanced way, but then it's also a matter of access. Who does have the access to actually tell these stories in bigger platforms where there's like a cap at the entrance, right? A gatekeeping of the people who are minorities, who have perspectives that could add to the conversation, just don't make it into the conversation. So I think when it comes to like the concept itself of pop culture and mainstream, there's going to be inevitably a trickle down of what gets to pop culture is what is filtered through all of this gatekeeping through privilege. And then we can see even the small tidbits can have a lot of effect. Like I know back home, I can have conversations, for example, about autism through the comparisons with Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory, which isn't a great example of representation, but nonetheless, using that character as an example, I've had people in my life understand that kind of struggle through him. Like I believe there is like one episode where he's struggling to understand why he's supposed to do some things, right? And one of his friends tells him it's a non-optional social requirement. And that's like, or something like that. I don't remember the exact words, but the exact phrase has kind of entered my vocabulary and my friend's vocabulary. So that when we are struggling with social cues and we're like, well, why? I don't want to do this. We just use that phrase to help each other. And these are people who don't necessarily belong in like spaces where the conversation around neurodivergence is being had. But that TV show, as flawed as it absolutely is, has still helped. So even that little bit has gone a long way. And I can even imagine how much good it would be to actually have own voices representation and more genuine, nuanced takes.
Princess, what do you think?
I agree with both Marza and Kath, but I also want to add one of the reasons why discussions of mental health is not in mainstream media is because mainstream media doesn't see that they're going to make money with it. And for example, this soap opera called The Bold and the Beautiful, and there's this mentally ill woman, crazy psychopath, sociopath. Sometimes they call her psychopath, sometimes they refer her as a sociopath. So it depends on the day, but called Sheila Carter. Whenever she's coming back on the show, they've killed her, they've put her in jail, but every time they have the character come back on the show, it's always to bring the ratings back up. And she's this stereotypical, insane psychopath person on the show. Yeah.
What's interesting is you were kind of presaging what I wanted to talk about next, which is why we didn't see so much of more positive and realistic depictions. And it does, I think that idea of the sensationalism of these stereotypes is perhaps a reason why. But I want to throw it open to all of you to discuss that idea more. I mean, what do you see as the reasons for why we don't have better depictions of mental health in mainstream?
I agree with Princess. I think that like there's definitely a lot of money in having these and specifically like mental health issues. Mental health issues, like I think they are often at the crux of like narrative. And in that sense, I really like David Mitchell and Snyder's like concept of narrative prosthesis, where they say like the disabled person is often not only at the center of the narrative, but the narrative in some cases doesn't exist without them. And one of the fandom that I really like, and I'm really dating myself, is Firefly. And in the story of Firefly, the character that if you remove her from the story, there literally is no story, is like the character, and I'm having like a brain melt. Oh, what's it? River, right? So River, the crazy character, it is literally, if you take away River, you no longer have a reason to tell this story. And I think that this is often the case in many shows like that. Everything that's like procedural, like mystery, like or police things, it's often like based. I think Criminal Mind was a good example of that. It's kind of like it's a whole show based on an exploitation of like mental health stereotypes, right? And I think they persist specifically because they're already current in society. People like understand them, and because of that, they become like a economically viable narrative trope. That if you have that, you know your show's gonna do well. And so I think that aspect of the commodification of mental health as a way to make culture and make money in culture is like, it's very central.
Yeah, if I could just pop in there quick, because I study professional wrestling, and that's also my biggest fandom right now. And the company I follow, AEW, has done, I think, a lot of good things, at least with their intentions are good, because they've created areas. If you go to a live show and you have sensory issues, you're able to go into a space that's designed to be more accommodating and things like that. And they have a lot of wrestlers who are very open about their mental health, which is not something that has been very common in professional wrestling. But I do wonder the extent to which they are using these real stories of mental health to essentially put over the wrestlers and to help to differentiate themselves from the big wrestling company, WWE. So it on the one hand, I think I see the good intentions, but there is still that commodification. They're still potentially doing it as a way to differentiate themselves and position themselves and thus profit. I'm sorry, Mars, you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I think I just agree with everything that's been said, and like that's reduced down to capitalism, because when we come to talk about media, and especially in film and television, that's a very high budget necessarily art form compared to, for example, novels or even music. There is just more money required to begin with, to the investment, and more money involved, to the point that I believe I read somewhere that in America, Hollywood lobbied so that cinema wouldn't be considered an art form, but rather an industry for tax purposes. So ultimately, it is maybe the bigger art-wise money-based industry. So it makes sense that they are so money motivated, and there's only going to be representation if it benefits a bottom line. And this kind of reminded me of something that Jack Halberstam says about trans representation, which is that can be largely divided in 3 categories, which is trivialization, stabilization, and rationalization. And especially the concept of trivialization is about making fun, or on the other side, depicting as scary. Because both things can help distance the audience, right? Who isn't mentally ill or transgender, or like, I believe this concept can be applied to many kinds of representation. It kind of felt fitting for this conversation because of that. Because it's othering and turning into a spectacle makes for a juicy show, essentially, without caring for the repercussions, which is why I also think, of course, today we're focusing on representation, but it's hard to talk about representation without considering that representation's impact and then role on people's mental health. I think they're very embedded with each other.
But it does. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Princess, then I'll ask a question.
Oh, I was just going to say, in all of the pop culture forms, music does better in representing mental health. Maybe it's because it's real people, that's the ones that's singing or writing the songs about their mental health or someone's mental health.
That, though, I wonder too, given like talking about music, talking about more niche streaming technologies, talking about like the Babadook, and which is essentially, that's indie horror. You're talking about kind of the more independent producers at this point. And I even thinking about like BoJack or Tuca and Birdie, those are definitely more indie productions. They're not mainstream productions. And with music, especially these days, when you don't necessarily have to go through one of the big recording companies.
Yeah.
Do you think that ability to be smaller, be more in control of your art is one of the reasons why we do see these depictions in these specific locations?
music is the first thing I thought about, especially when it comes to like, we have at least two very famous, relatively songs or bands that made a song titled Lithium, which is literally medication. And I'm not even talking about the recent years, right? We have the Nirvana song and the Evanescence song, which are both from decades ago. So like, and it's a kind of conversation that destigmatization of mental health medication specifically, one that hasn't really come through. Where I was watching some film, I don't remember the title, but I remember being struck. It was a horror film, and to denote these characters descending into madness, they show him taking these medicines, and you could see the label on the medicine, and it was propanolol, which is a very common anxiety medication that isn't even, like, it's not even one of the most stigmatized one, but even just the visual cue of a person with a bottle of pills, doesn't matter what those pills are, denotes something wrong with this person, right? Whereas in music, this conversation has been more open for longer, and more accepting. Although on the other hand, you have very recent, very mainstream pop, Olivia Rodrigo just yelling the word sociopath as an insult, which is that song kind of really sits poorly with me.
I think also, and to your point, that to your question about maybe because of their independence, even with pop stars who are through big pop stars like Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Madonna, whoever, Rihanna, and they're going through the record labels, they're able to sing or write about mental health struggles. Taylor Swift's last album was about her mental health problem, her eating disorder, mental health problems.
Although I do wonder if we're looking at maybe an intersectionality issue coming in now too, about how all those people you just mentioned identify as cisgender women. And
yes,
definitely more the stereotype that women are more able to express their emotions, which is usually what is then connected to mental health problems. So that might be something to talk about too. But Kath, you wanted to jump in?
So many good things that were said. I think, like when you're talking about, I think like femininity, anything that's like coded feminine is definitely seen as already like on the path of madness, if you want, or has the potential towards madness. And I say femininity because I think for sure it's cisgender women, but anything that's coded with a feminine, it's kind of like, it's still like a way of putting into question that identity or that person, I feel. When it comes to music, full disclosure, I'm less into music than I am into narratives. But I do think that one of the things that was mentioned is the role that pop stars have played in like maybe I'd say driving, because I don't think like it's necessarily like their analysis, but in driving like discussions about mental health issues in popular culture. And you have like very like you have all these discussions that are very polarizing that happen like around like Free Britney, or around like famous people that say I have mental health issue. And I know that that's something that happened in certain fandom. I'm thinking about Supernatural, and I'm sure Dean could talk like a lot more. They could talk a lot more about that, where you have like the main characters that the main actors that play the characters that then say that like this is the mental health issues that is going on with me. And that's like also that's also like an aspect that I find like that's interesting. But music is interesting because you have the lyrics, you have like the song, and now you have like you have like the video aspect of it, and you can take it up like all together, or as like an audience, or you can take it up just like as it's explained. And I think maybe because it's lyrical, when you're talking about mental health struggles through like a song, it becomes like, it's like this very visceral and direct way of like dealing with the emotions that people are feeling without like medicalization, which I find is like, it is like very, it's very important to have that as well. That was a little bit disjointed.
No, it's fine, because I like, it made me think about this possibility that across the world and popular culture, that maybe we have these safer spaces in which the conditions are more favorable towards having these conversations that are honest and realistic and ultimately more positive and less stigmatized. Yeah. Do we?
At the same time, though, I do think that even when you have like these big stars that are like coming out, if you want, as having a mental health issue, I think that as Mars mentioned, the industry is really capitalizing on this and they're making a commodity of like of their mental health issue, where that itself becomes like a cash cow in a way. And one of the things that's so infuriating about disability discourse and mental health, specifically mental health, though, I think, is that the people that have mental health issues are never seen to own the narrative. So like there's this feeling that anybody can talk about it and it belongs to everybody in a sense. Which has some aspects that's really problematic.
Yes, you can see that with Britney Spears, you know, and as she's freed, everybody's wants, and she's posting stuff on her Instagram and social media. Everybody's want to be a psychologist and psychiatrist and diagnose her, say that she needs her medications or whatever. Everybody wants to talk about. She doesn't really talk about her mental health. She's just being happy, doing silly things, and people want to diagnose her and everything. Even with Selena Gomez and Demi, the other Disney star, Demi? Yeah, they have come out explaining that their mental health issues, and people still want to, even though they have taken charge of the narrative, people still want to take charge of their own narrative. And then you can read all the negative comments from fans and non-fans under the Instagrams and Facebook social media.
It makes me think about something my partner is talking about in his dissertation, and the extent to which where these how all these discourses circulate and how much we can actually control any of our discourses. I kind of wish I'd brought him on now, because you think he'd have a lot to say on that. I do think, though, bringing up back that question maybe and getting at something Mars wanted to address, that idea of how intertangled representation and impact are. Given the capitalist bent, and if we take maybe capitalist versus more independent artistic, do you think that the capitalist cares as much about the impact that the representations are having, or does maybe the artistic independent care more? I'm just curious on that one.
I mean, I just don't think capitalism cares, full stop. I just had one thought that I really wanted to get out about the music conversation, because it was also like I think when it comes to the music itself, especially, it's a lot more talked about the mental states and mental health struggle of people, but with that, it comes also like a complete, almost demedicalization. It's very rare to find a song that uses words like depression, bipolar, whatever, you know, like they're gonna talk through metaphors, because music is more like poetry than it is fiction, narrative. They're gonna use these metaphors and express their feelings. But it's also be less dangerous because you're not naming the disease. And I think a lot of the stigma around mental health is less around actually having feelings, although there is a part to that. And it's more about naming them as conditions and actually wanting to treat them. because it's everyone gets sad and everyone gets anxious, but it's different to have chronic depression or an anxiety disorder. And so I think that might be a reason why music is more open about mental health, because it's not naming disorders often.
I could see that. Yeah, I can definitely, because a lot of the songs are about mental health, especially from the artists that I listen to, they don't necessarily mention eating disorder, depression, bipolar.
Yeah, or like the artist might be open about it, but not put it in the lyrics, which makes sense. Because, a lot of illness names are a bit sterile, they're medical, because they're disorders. So they're not as poetic, but also there is like a pros and cons situation there.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the not naming disabilities, and I think this is used a lot with autistic characters as well, where technically like all the marker of being an autistics are there. However, it's never mentioned that the person is autistic, and the person always exists like separated from any kind of community, which is the same thing that happens often in mental health representation or disability representation in general. It's like we don't whatever character is in the story, they don't know anybody else that's like disabled, right? They don't have community, that doesn't exist. And I think that is harmful because it individualizes disability, and it really like separates it from its social consequences in a way that makes it like the problem of the person, as opposed to like a social project, a social like people that are part of society and that are valuable as themselves. Not as like potentially being cured, not as like being able to pass, right? But as people that are valuable the way they are. Disability as like desirable in society. And I don't think that a representation, mainstream representation of disability and mental health issue is concerned with that. Because as Mars mentioned, like capitalism is not about caring about people. It's about exploiting that. That's like the system, right?
Well, and it relates to like some theorizations that have been going on looking at feminism and how more modern feminism, the commodified feminism, is being presented as, individualized empowerment and not as collectivist action, because, collectivist action, that's scary. That's where real change comes.
Yeah, I think that the individualization does come back to capitalism doesn't care. Not only does it not care, it actively wants us isolated and away from community, because when community happens, mutual hate spontaneously happens. It's not even a matter of organized political action. It's a matter of I'm gonna cook for my friends. And we're gonna help each other because that's what people naturally do. How one of the first signs of evolved civilization is a healed femur. It is intrinsic in human nature to help each other when we are not isolated and all far away, which is why I think meaningful collective disability representation cannot happen in mainstream media within capitalism, because it shows the person's value beyond productivity.
Princess, do you want to add here?
I just want to say that in addition to capitalism doesn't care, capitalism is sexist in the way, even in the way how we deal with mental health. Everybody's talking about how, for example, Britney needs to be back under her conservatorship, but we have Kanye, everybody knows who's bipolar and who's doing stuff that's questionable, no voice calling for him to be put
Mhm.
under a conservatorship.
Yeah.
If anything, even then, like, I think the conversation around Kanye uses the bipolar to move away from the anti-Semitism, which
Yeah.
you know, like, I think also that bipolar is one of those illnesses, like, it's also different illnesses that are considered as dangerous versus
Yeah.
addictive, right? If you have psychotic symptoms, you are a societal danger.
No, that's very true. And I think it leaves aside like all the politics that exist around who gets diagnosed with what, right? So there have been studies that have shown that like Black boys get diagnosed like overwhelmingly with more like dangerous labels than like white boys, for example. So you have like people that would fall under the umbrella of ADHD, for example, or other learning disabilities that are then like you're looking at like the behavior instead. So so then you have like a whole section of children and adolescents that are not getting the supports that they want because they are being medicalized as being dangerously unstable instead of being like given support, right? And I think that that's like really like I wish more people understood the politics that exist around around diagnosis are along gender lines, sexual line, racial line. They represent all the tensions and the oppression that exists in society, right? And often like it's seen like this idea that there's and this is something that has been like in society throughout. There are good disabled people and there are bad disabled people, right? And the good disabled people will get resources, and the bad disabled people are either like they're faking it, or they're dangerous to society, or they should be like institutionalized or something of the kind. They should be put aside, and they're used as like a marker of what we do to people who don't fit in. You know, and so I think it creates like a lot of like necessity for non-disclosure of needing help, and yeah, and I think we see this in something in popular culture through like making it like an individual problem or problem of the person, and we're not linking it to political action and to political projects. Right, it's not linked to like healthcare or access to healthcare or stuff like that.
Or it's the reverse. It's you've got a mental health diagnosis being used by politicians to further oppress someone they don't like, such as all of the legislation right now, not just about trans kids, but just drag shows and the popular culture of drag shows being impacted by these assumptions on mental health.
Yeah, and this like the first thing I'm thinking about is how back in the day, a slave in America who wanted to be free was diagnosed with a mental illness. Like that was considered a mental illness because psychiatry is a political tool of the oppression, and it doesn't mean obviously the mental health diagnosis as a whole isn't valid, but it is used as long as the doctors are systematically privileged people. It's always going to be a tool of the oppression. In the same way, like BPD is mostly diagnosed in women, no matter what kind of mood swing or actual symptom a person presents, they're more likely to get diagnosed with borderline personality, even though it might be ADHD, it might be autism, it might be bipolar, like we were saying, because those are considered boys' illnesses. And if you're a woman, you're just emotional, and you have extremely emotional disorder, which is basically, a lot of people have been saying within disability spaces and mental health spaces that in many ways BPD has replaced the diagnosis of hysteria. Not because that's not a meaningful disorder that some people actually have, but because a lot of other people get diagnosed it just because they're very emotional.
So how do I want to put this? I was diagnosed years ago with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, and then something of a personality disorder. They never really locked it down. And I've been struggling with that ever since, because on one hand, it might, align more with what the DSM says for borderline or histrionic, but then, and this is maybe getting at the technology, I've been watching a lot more TikToks and YouTubes of women who have experiences with ADD and autism. And it makes me think about how my behavior might actually align more there. But it's hard then to be able to know what to do. And I have a therapist who doesn't think that the diagnosis is as important as understanding the trauma. But then at the same time, I see a lot of, those influencers on TikTok and YouTube, and the fact that they're influencers is already something interesting. But a lot of them talking about how, and even like actual therapy, like dialectical behavior therapy, which I do group for, they talk about how you as the individual have to learn how to respond to the stress that you're engaging with. Not that you and others who are experiencing the stress should try to tackle the source of the stress and make that go away, but it's you as the individual who has to learn how to deal with it. And it makes me wonder how much that individualized approach to therapy and mental health treatment is also being circulated through popular culture. We often see, I think about Frasier, the television show Frasier. I'm writing about that right now. We have these depictions of, you go see a therapist, it's an individual on a couch, you go talk, and then maybe you're better, maybe you got things to work on. But it's not only that you have the depiction of an individual struggling, but then the therapeutic approach for how to deal with it is usually individualized as well.
Mhm.
Perhaps something of a curveball to throw out this late in the discussion.
I'm just thinking about it, and I'm not sure where my thoughts are going. It was a lot of interesting things.
I do think it keeps boiling down to community, to people being like a communal species that doesn't just need that one-on-one therapy support to improve, to be better and to function, especially when it comes to neurodivergences. You're not going to cure autism, nor do we want to, because there is nothing to be cured. It's just a different functioning, and therefore it requires a societal adjustment, more acceptance, more understanding. And I think that's why, especially when it comes to neurodivergences that don't look at treatment, like medicines or therapy, but rather understanding how you function, a lot of those social media communities are very welcoming of self-diagnosis, because ultimately, which I think is very interesting, because then you are in a way taking away the power of that institution, right? That is trying to weaponize mental illness. But on the other hand, obviously, not everyone is going to have the tools to fully comprehend it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I am autistic or not. If I employ the coping mechanisms and model of understanding myself through the lens of autism, and that helps me function better because the coping mechanisms make it so that my brain has an easier time, it doesn't matter whether a doctor would or wouldn't diagnose me. The empirical fact that being around other autistic people and communicating in an autistic way does improve my life and make my communications better is a fact.
Yeah. I think that the reason why my brain was a little bit my synapses were firing is because I deal with a lot of these issues right now in my job in the Canadian government. And I once told somebody in the government that in order to be accessible, you have to want to change how it is that the structures exist and how you do things, right? Because this idea of wellness can be like extremely, and this like wellness as like this individual chore that you have to do to make yourself be mentally okay with being oppressed and with living in unequal structure that like cause you pain and that contribute to like whatever, whether it's physical or like mental health issue that contribute to like your difficulty in being in that space. Like it's not the problem of the person, and wellness puts a lot of like emphasis on take care of yourself and self-care and stuff like that. But self-care should be understood as existing on a communal level. You can't do self-care in isolation. You have to have like community that supports that self-care. And if you're just telling people like, and this is what happens in employment and in workforces a lot of time, it's kind of like, oh, we're going to give you like different workshops on self-care, different tools about self-care, but then we're not changing like the expectation of how it is that you're supposed to be an employee, about like the workload. We're not changing we're not changing the structures. We're just telling you that now it's your problem. Right?
Yeah.
And people don't take into account like the exhaustion that it causes for like disabled people to have like double duty as like the people. I mean, for me, it's my job. I get paid to do that, but it's still exhausting. Like as a person with ADHD, who was also like diagnosed thanks to like being on social media and knowing other like ADHD and autistic people. It can be so exhausting to just exist in this world as a disabled person. And it's not because of us, it's literally because of the system, right? Sorry, I'm laughing, it's gallows humor. Like I have to laugh because like, otherwise like.
What else you gonna do?
Yeah.
But I do think this idea of looking at how popular culture serves that system more than it serves the people in the system. Now, I know I take on so many book projects, but man, that would be a good book project. All right, so we're about at time here, so I know I have a meeting in a couple minutes, so I can't go too long, but I just wanted to say, if there was one popular culture text that you think does a good job that you would recommend people watch to learn more about a particular mental health issue, or mental health in general, what would you recommend to someone?
I think personally, I really love Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, the TV show. I think it does a brilliant job at like reflecting on community and like how social interactions really affect mental health, as well as it destigmatizes personality disorders, which I think is a very big one of the scary mental illnesses, right? And it does it all in a very entertaining way. And so like a bit of a parody musical soap opera, which I think is brilliant. That's exactly my kind of thing, a bit camp.
I completely agree. I love that one. Princess?
It's not on anymore, but there was this soap opera which I found did a very good depiction of multiple personality, DDP, One Life to Live. One of the main characters, Vicky Lord, suffered from it. And one thing I liked what they did about it was that it intersected with violence and sexual violence and community. Even though she suffered from this, she had a community of people, her family, her friends, and she wasn't just a victim. She ran one of the land views, I think the city they were living in, one of the land view's biggest publishing empires and newspapers. So
nice.
I think they did a good job with her on that. Although her daughter also ended up having it also.
Hmm.
One of her daughters ended up having it. But I think that they did a really good job. Usually, like, some of the soap operas do a good job in mental health. Like One Life to Live was one of those. And those soap operas are not on air anymore. I think these soap operas, One Life to Live, All My Children, Guiding Light, As the Wiltons, did a very good job of doing, depicting social issues like mental health, racism, and other stuff. But this is not what Hollywood wants. So.
Okay.
Okay, so I think for my part, I think I would encourage people to go into fan fiction on AO3 and to put like disability and mental health issue and to search at what fans are doing. It's unequal for depending on fandom. But I think it's still interesting to see it, not because it would be like a perfect discourse, but because it's really like a space where people can express themselves and can grow and can like create communities around like I share this experience and think about this thing and so forth. I do like Firefly as a complete narrative about mental health because of the fact that it shows a lot of how different characters react to mental health, and because the last episode is actually like everybody gets saved because of River and because of the fact that she is the way that she is. And I've always found this like as a whole narrative to be interesting. Like you can't take necessarily like the individual episodes because some of them like make you so infuriating the way that she's like infantilized. But the whole narrative and how it ends, I find is that last episode. I would encourage like people to like watch it. I mean, it's one season, so but yeah.
Can I just drop 2 other titles because it's really hard to choose? I think in terms of community representation, especially, I really liked Please Like Me, which is also not on air anymore. It's an Australian sitcom, kind of like a comedy show. And completely different, but I couldn't not mention something horror, is In the Flesh, which is a British horror drama mini series. It's super short. It's like 9 episodes, and I still cry about it. And it's so good in the way that it both depicts textual and talks about actual mental illnesses, but then also uses the zombie virus as a metaphor for otherness and stigmatization. I think personally I interpret it as personality disorders and those other dangerous quote unquote disorders, and the way people who are trying to get better and like learning how to not harm others are treated as social complete outcasts and therefore pushed to not get better because they don't have a community anymore.
Fascinating. I'll have to look into that one for sure. I love zombie stuff.
In the Flesh is amazing. I recommend it as well.
Yeah, it's really good.
Well, I'm the one that's left out. I'm going to go watch that then. All right. Thank you all for being here today. I think this is a great conversation, and I love finding fellow anti-capitalists when it comes to this matter, I guess. All right.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Of course.
Thank you. Bye.